My name is Audrey, and I am 38 years old. I work as a historical archivist in Boston, spending my days surrounded by centuries-old documents, deciphering faded ink, and tracing the fragile paper trails of people who have long since passed away. I make a living by finding things that other people have lost, forgotten, or intentionally buried. It is a quiet profession, one that requires patience, an eye for microscopic details, and a fundamental understanding that the past always leaves a record. You cannot simply erase something that existed. It always leaves a shadow. I have spent my entire adult life applying this principle to the history of a city, but I never expected to have to apply it to my own marriage. I want to tell you about a number. The number is $145,000. That was the appraised value of the antique emerald and diamond set that my great-grandmother brought with her when she crossed the Atlantic in the 1920s. But to me, its value was not measured in dollars. It was measured in the weight of my family's history, in the generations of women who had worn those stones on their wedding days, and in the promise I made to my mother that I would pass them down to my own children. They were the most precious things I owned. I also want to tell you about the night I stood at the top of the grand marble staircase at the annual Boston Heritage Gala, wearing those exact same emeralds. I want to tell you about the way the chandeliers caught the deep, unmistakable green of the stones, throwing tiny prisms of light across the crowded ballroom. And I want to tell you about the face of my mother-in-law, Eleanor, sitting at the head table below me. I want to describe the exact moment her polite, practiced smile froze, cracked, and completely shattered as she looked up and saw the jewelry on my neck. The very same jewelry she had secretly sold off months earlier, absolutely certain that she had gotten rid of it, and me, forever. She thought she had committed the perfect betrayal. She thought because I was quiet, I was also blind. She thought my husband, Julian, would simply take her word over mine, because that is what he had been conditioned to do his entire life. She was right about Julian, at least for a while, but she was profoundly wrong about me. Before I explain how those emeralds found their way back to my neck, and how a single, flawlessly documented dossier of evidence dismantled a 15-year illusion of family loyalty, I need to take you back. Because the betrayal did not begin with the empty safe, and the victory did not begin at the gala. It began in the quiet, empty spaces of a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. To understand the end, you have to truly understand the people who built the beginning. Before we dive into how a single paper trail destroyed a 15-year illusion of family loyalty, I want to take a brief moment to invite you to join our community. If you find yourself drawn to stories about uncovering the hidden truth, methodical investigations, and quiet, calculated karma, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on your notifications. Your support truly helps us bring more of these powerful, real-life experiences to light. By subscribing today, you ensure that these narratives of resilience and justice continue to be shared with those who really need to hear them most. I met Julian when we were both 27 years old. He was a junior architect at a mid-size firm downtown, and I had just started my career in the city archives. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party, and I was immediately drawn to his steadiness. Julian was not the loudest person in the room, nor did he try to be. He was steady in the way some people are not boring, but deeply grounded. He made decisions slowly and kept them. He had a way of listening to you that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. We were a good match on paper, and we were genuinely happy in those early years. We built a life that was, by most measures, a good one. But Julian came with something I did not fully understand at 27. He came with a family name that carried weight in Boston, a lineage of old money that moved quietly but powerfully through every decision they made. And he came with his mother, Eleanor. To understand my marriage, you have to understand the architecture of Julian's loyalty. Julian was raised in a house where love was conditional, tied inextricably to approval, and approval was something his mother dispensed like currency. He was a good man, but he was a man who had spent his entire life learning how to keep the peace in a family where peace meant absolute compliance. He loved me. I truly believe that. But love and honesty are not the same container. And for 15 years, my husband kept them very carefully separated. One container for me and one for his family, never poured into the same glass at the same time. In the beginning, the shadow Eleanor cast over us was subtle. She did not yell or make grand demands. She was a woman of polite tolerance. When we bought our first house, a modest 3-room in a quiet neighborhood, she walked through the rooms, smiled her practiced smile, and said it was charming for a starter home. When we got married, she controlled the guest list with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate merger, consulting Julian on every detail and addressing her questions to the air above my left shoulder. I learned early on that when it came to Eleanor, Julian would never take my side if it meant causing a disruption. He would hold my hand in private and tell me that his mother was just particular, that it was easier to let her have her way, that she meant well. He deferred to her constantly. At first, I accepted this. I told myself that this was what it meant to marry into an established family. I told myself that his deference was a sign of respect for his elders, not a lack of respect for me. I made peace with the arrangement by making it make sense, but that kind of quiet erosion does something to a person over time. You start to realize that you are building a life with someone who is constantly looking over their shoulder for permission to be happy. We drifted not all at once, but in microscopic increments. The drift happens when one partner consistently prioritizes their family's approval over their spouse's peace. You stop arguing about it because you run out of energy for the particular exhaustion of defending yourself to someone who is never going to change their mind. I became a quiet presence in my own marriage. I focused on my work at the archives. I paid our bills, maintained our home, and I learned to navigate family dinners by being pleasant and unmemorable. Julian seemed relieved by my compliance. He thought we had found a perfect balance. He thought the silence meant I was content. He did not realize that the silence was me learning how to survive in a structure where my voice was structurally irrelevant. This was the foundation we built upon. It looked solid from the outside, but inside it was hollow. It was perfectly primed for someone like Eleanor to walk in and dismantle it without making a sound, and she did. Eleanor was a woman of polite tolerance. In her world, you didn't have to be overtly cruel to make someone feel like they didn't belong. You just had to treat them like a temporary guest in a house they were supposed to own. She was the matriarch of a family that had land, inherited property, and old money that moved quietly but powerfully through every decision they made. To her, I was an outsider, a girl from a modest background who had been lucky enough to marry into the family's legacy. She never raised her voice. She never said anything that could be clipped and used as evidence of malice. Instead, she spoke to the air above my left shoulder, or she asked about my day with the tone of someone completing a mandatory checklist. I came from a family that valued stories over status. We didn't have a trust fund, but we had the emeralds. The set consisted of a necklace, a pair of drop earrings, and a delicate bracelet, all crafted in the Art Deco style of the 1920s. My great-grandmother, Maura, had brought them with her when she fled poverty in Ireland. They were her only asset, hidden in the lining of a worn-out coat. She had worked as a domestic servant for decades, saving every penny, but she never sold the stones. They were her anchor, her proof that she was a woman of substance. They had been worn by my grandmother on her wedding day in 1954 and by my own mother in 1982. When I put them on, I didn't just feel beautiful. I felt the collective strength of the women who had survived so I could stand here. Eleanor, however, saw things differently. To her, jewelry was social currency, and she was the ultimate banker. I remember the first time I showed her the set. It was shortly after Julian and I got engaged. We were having tea in her sunroom, a space that felt more like a museum of things I wasn't allowed to touch than a living area. I had brought the velvet box to show her, thinking it might be a way for us to connect. I was naive back then. I thought she would appreciate the craftsmanship and the history. She opened the box, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something raw in her eyes. It wasn't admiration, it was recognition. She knew exactly what those stones were worth. She didn't look at the artistry. She appraised the clarity of the emeralds and the carat weight of the diamonds. Then, just as quickly, the mask of polite indifference returned. She closed the lid with a soft click and pushed it back toward me. "It's very vibrant," she said, her voice like silk over glass. "A bit theatrical for a young woman in your position, don't you think? It requires a certain kind of presence to carry off stones of this magnitude. I fear they might wear you rather than the other way around." It was a classic Eleanor strike. On the surface, it sounded like advice. Beneath it, she was telling me I wasn't enough. I wasn't grand enough, rich enough, or Boston enough for my own family's heritage. Over the years, she would make little comments whenever the emeralds were mentioned. She'd suggest they were safer in a bank vault than in our home safe. She'd mention how risky it was for someone with my active lifestyle to own such delicate pieces. She treated the emeralds like a mistake I had made, a possession that was too large for my small life. Julian, as always, tried to bridge the gap by being invisible. "She's just worried about the insurance, Audrey," he would say when I told him her comments made me uncomfortable. "She comes from a generation where these things are managed differently. Just take it as a compliment that she notices them at all." But I saw the way she looked at them. It was the look of someone who believes that something valuable has ended up in the wrong hands. In her eyes, I was merely a placeholder. She looked at me as an ordinary archivist who spent her time in dusty basements, and she looked at the emeralds as a treasure that belonged in a ballroom she controlled. She believed that history belonged to people who could afford to buy it, not to people like me who merely preserved it. She didn't realize that as an archivist, I knew that the most important part of any treasure isn't the object itself, but the record of how it moved from one hand to another. I understood the weight of those emeralds better than she ever could. I knew they weren't just stones. They were a legacy of survival. And I knew that Eleanor, for all her manners, was a woman who didn't understand the difference between owning something and deserving it. This fundamental disagreement formed the backdrop of our entire relationship. I kept the emeralds locked away, only bringing them out for the most special occasions, while Eleanor continued to act as if they didn't exist. She focused her energy on Julian, constantly reminding him of his obligations to the family name, all while treating me like a footnote in his biography. I thought I could outlast her. I thought that if I remained respectful and diligent, her tolerance might eventually turn into something resembling genuine acceptance. I didn't yet understand that for Eleanor, acceptance was never the goal. The goal was restoration, restoring the balance of power to a version of the world where she was the only one who decided what was truly valuable. She wasn't waiting for me to fit in, she was waiting for me to fail. The betrayal didn't happen with a bang. It happened in the quiet aftermath of a weekend trip to the coast. It was late September, and Julian had suggested we take a short break to celebrate my birthday. It was a rare gesture of spontaneity from him, and I welcomed it. Eleanor, in a sudden fit of generosity, offered to house sit for us. She claimed she wanted to ensure our garden was watered and that the mail didn't pile up, as there had been a string of petty thefts in the neighborhood. Looking back, the setup was so transparent it's almost embarrassing, but at the time, I chose to see it as a peace offering. I wanted to believe that after years of coldness, she was finally trying to be a mother-in-law. We returned on a Sunday evening. The house was spotless, smelling faintly of Eleanor's preferred lavender polish. There was even a small vase of flowers on the kitchen island. I felt a pang of guilt for ever doubting her. After we unpacked, I went to the small floor safe in our bedroom closet. I didn't check it every day, but I had a habit of verifying my belongings after being away. It was a professional reflex from the archives, always account for the inventory. I knelt on the carpet, punched in the code, and pulled the heavy door open. The safe wasn't empty. Julian's passport was there, our emergency cash was untouched, and my other, less valuable pieces of jewelry were exactly where I'd left them. But the long, midnight blue velvet box, the one that held the emeralds, was gone. I remember the way the air seemed to leave the room. I didn't scream. I just stared at the empty space where my history used to sit. I reached in, my hands trembling, feeling the cold metal of the safe's floor as if I could somehow find the box by touch. I searched the entire closet. I searched the dresser drawers. I searched the bathroom cabinets. I spent 3 hours turning our bedroom upside down, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. When Julian came in and saw the chaos, I told him. I expected him to be as horrified as I was. Instead, he just stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, looking at me with a strange, weary pity. "Audrey, are you sure you put it back there after the charity dinner last month?" he asked. His voice was too calm. "Maybe you were tired and tucked it away somewhere else for safekeeping." "Julian, I am a historical archivist," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My entire life is based on knowing exactly where things are. I put that box in the back left corner of the safe on August 14th. I haven't touched it since." "People make mistakes, Audrey," he replied softly. "Even professionals. Why don't we call Mom? She was here all weekend. Maybe she moved the safe during her deep cleaning or saw something." We called her. Eleanor's response was a masterclass in psychological warfare. She didn't get defensive, she got hurt. I could hear the quiver in her voice over the speakerphone. "Audrey, dear, are you suggesting that I had something to do with your jewelry? After I spent my entire weekend looking after your home?" She let out a long, shaky sigh. "Julian, I noticed Audrey has been very stressed lately, very forgetful. Maybe the pressure at the archives is getting to her. I saw her looking at those emeralds a few weeks ago with such a strange expression. Are you sure she hasn't dealt with them herself?" That was the first seed, the implication that I was either losing my mind or that I had sold my own heritage. Julian didn't defend me. In fact, over the next few months, he became my primary gaslighter. He started small. He would find things I had supposedly lost, a set of keys he'd actually hidden, a book I knew I'd finished, and present them to me as proof that my memory was failing. Every time I brought up the emeralds, he would shut me down with a look of profound exhaustion. "We've searched the house, Audrey. We've filed the police report. The police found no sign of forced entry. What else do you want me to do? Accept that my mother is a thief, or accept that you're having some kind of breakdown?" Eleanor would visit for tea and offer me vitamins for cognitive health. She would tell stories about distant relatives who lost their grip on reality at my age. She began telling our social circle that I was going through a difficult time and that Julian was being so brave for supporting me. I watched my husband drift further away from me and closer to her. He started taking her calls in the other room. He stopped looking me in the eye. The psychological toll was devastating. I started to doubt my own senses. I would wake up in the middle of the night and check the safe again, hoping the box would magically reappear. I felt like a ghost in my own home, a woman whose reality was being erased by the people who were supposed to love her. They were building a version of me that was unstable and unreliable, and for a long time I almost believed them. I felt small, silenced, and utterly alone. I was living inside a structure where my truth was treated as a symptom of an illness. But they forgot one thing. They forgot that I don't just find things. I document the process of their disappearance. And while I was crying in the dark, the archivist in me was starting to look for the trail they didn't think I could find. The shift didn't happen because of a grand epiphany. It happened because I was exhausted. I stopped crying on a Tuesday afternoon in early November. It was a cold, gray day in Boston, the kind where the mist clings to the brick buildings like a damp shroud. Julian had just left the room after another circular argument where he told me that my fixation on the emeralds was damaging our marriage. I sat on the edge of our bed, looking at my hands, and I realized that I didn't feel hurt anymore. I felt observant. For months, I had been trying to save my marriage emotionally. I had been begging for validation, pleading with Julian to believe me, and searching for comfort in a house that had become a courtroom where I was the only defendant. In that moment of absolute silence, I remembered who I was before I was Julian's wife or Eleanor's polite tolerance. I am an archivist. My entire career is built on the understanding that people lie, memories fade, and narratives are often manipulated, but the paper trail remains. In the sources I study, I have learned that the truth doesn't always announce itself with a shout. Sometimes it sits quietly in the margins of a ledger, waiting for someone to stop crying long enough to go looking for it. I thought of Sandra's words from the stories I'd studied. Emotion without information is just suffering. I decided right then that I was done with suffering. I stood up, walked to my vanity, and wiped my face. I looked at myself in the mirror, really looked at myself, for the first time in months. The woman looking back wasn't unstable or forgetful. She was a professional. She was a woman who knew how to deconstruct a lie by following the evidence it left behind. If Eleanor had sold my jewelry, she hadn't done it with a magic wand. She had used a phone. She had used a vehicle. She had likely used a broker or an auction house. She had created a transaction, and every transaction leaves a shadow. I stopped being the victim of the gaslighting and started being the silent witness to it. When Julian spoke to me that evening, his voice full of that practiced, weary pity, I didn't argue. I didn't try to prove my sanity. I simply nodded and changed the subject. I watched him relax, thinking he had finally managed me. He didn't realize that my compliance was no longer a sign of defeat. It was a tactical withdrawal. I needed him to stop watching me so that I could start watching them. I began to treat my own life like a cold case file. I realized that to find the truth, I had to separate my feelings from the facts. The fact was that the emeralds were gone. The fact was that Eleanor had been alone in the house. The fact was that Julian was choosing his mother's narrative over mine. My task was no longer to convince them. It was to document them. I felt a cold and clarifying calm settle over me. It was the same feeling I get when I find a missing piece of a genealogical puzzle in the archives, a sense of inevitable resolution. I wasn't just looking for my jewelry anymore. I was looking for the evidence of who these people truly were. I went to bed that night, not with a broken heart, but with a plan. The hunt had begun. I began the investigation on a rainy Monday morning, the same way I begin any historical research project, by establishing a timeline of access. In my world, objects don't just vanish, they are displaced. I needed to know exactly who had been in proximity to that safe during the window of time the emeralds disappeared. I started with our home's digital footprint. We had a smart security system that logged every time the front door was opened and every time the safe's digital keypad was engaged. I had always let Julian manage the app, but as a co-owner, I had my own login credentials that I'd never felt the need to use. Until now. Sitting in the quiet of my office at the archives, surrounded by the smell of old parchment and the hum of the HVAC system, I pulled up the logs for that September weekend. The records were clinical and unforgiving. Julian and I had left the house at 10:14 a.m. on Friday. Eleanor's code was used to enter the house at 11:30 a.m. that same day. But it was the safe's log that made my blood run cold. Our safe wasn't just a mechanical box. It was a modern model that recorded every entry attempt. On Saturday afternoon, at 2:42 p.m., there had been 4 failed attempts to enter the code. Then, at 2:48 p.m., a 5th attempt was successful. I stared at the screen. I knew my code. Julian knew his. Eleanor shouldn't have had either. But then I remembered a dinner party 6 months prior where Julian, after a few glasses of wine, had joked about how he used his childhood home's old street number as his secondary bypass code because he could never forget it. Eleanor had been sitting right next to him. She hadn't been deep cleaning the bedroom. She had been standing in my closet, methodically guessing her way into my private history. But a log entry isn't a confession. I needed to know where the emeralds went once they left the house. Emeralds of that quality, vivid green, Colombian origin, over 10 carats in the necklace alone, cannot be sold at a neighborhood pawn shop. They are too recognizable, too high profile. They require a specialist. I reached out to a contact in the antique jewelry world, a man named Marcus, who had helped the archives value estate donations in the past. I didn't tell him the jewelry was mine. I told him I was researching a lost 1920s Art Deco set for a theoretical provenance project. Marcus gave me a list of 3 high-end boutique brokers in the New England area who handled off-market discreet transactions for wealthy families. I spent the next 2 weeks systematically checking them. I wasn't Audrey the grieving wife. I was Audrey the forensic researcher. I discovered that Eleanor had made a trip to New York City just 3 days after we returned from our vacation. I found this not through her, but through a shared family calendar Julian had forgotten I could see, where she had marked a dentist appointment in a city 3 hours away. I hired a private investigator, a former detective named Elias, who specialized in white-collar recovery. I gave him the security logs and Eleanor's travel dates. Within 4 days, Elias found the connection. Eleanor hadn't gone to a dentist. She had met with a private broker named Vanderhouse in Manhattan. Vanderhouse dealt in quiet sales for families who wanted to liquidate assets without the public spectacle of an auction house like Sotheby's. The paper trail began to bloom. Elias managed to obtain a copy of the intake form from a contact within the broker's office. My heart stopped when I saw the digital scan of the document. There, on the formal letterhead, was a forged appraisal. It claimed the emeralds belonged to Eleanor, inherited from her own mother, and that she had the full legal right to sell them. The forgery was sophisticated. It used an old appraisal from our actual insurance company as a template, but had the names and dates digitally altered. It was exactly the kind of parallel reality Sandra's mother-in-law had created in the stories I'd studied. Eleanor hadn't just stolen the jewelry. She had attempted to rewrite its history to make herself the protagonist. The broker had sold the set to an anonymous private collector for a fraction of its true value, $110,000. The shortfall Eleanor had always complained about in her own lifestyle was suddenly covered by the ghost of my great-grandmother's struggle. I felt a surge of cold, analytical fury. Every transfer, every forged signature, and every digital timestamp was a brick in the wall I was building around her. I didn't stop there. I needed to know Julian's level of involvement. I went through our joint bank statements and his individual accounts. I found nothing. No influx of cash, no secret transfers. This was the most painful part of the investigation. Realizing that my husband wasn't a co-conspirator in the theft, but he was a co-conspirator in the cover-up. He had seen his mother's evidence, likely the same forged appraisal or a fabricated story about me being unstable, and he had chosen to believe her because it was easier than facing the truth. He had allowed her to gaslight me because he was too weak to stand up to the woman who had controlled his narrative since birth. I spent my evenings at the kitchen table, cross-referencing Elias's findings with my own archival notes. I created a dossier, formatted exactly like the audit report Sarah Carter used in her story. Column A, date. Column B, action. Column C, evidence. I included the security logs showing the unauthorized entry. I included the GPS data Elias had pulled showing Eleanor's car at the Manhattan broker's address. I included the high-resolution scan of the forged appraisal. And finally, I included the most damning piece of all, a recorded statement from the broker's assistant, who confirmed that a woman matching Eleanor's description had specifically requested that the sale be final, immediate, and untraceable. As an archivist, I knew that the power of a record isn't just in the facts it contains, but in the way those facts are presented. I wasn't going to just hand this over in a fit of rage. I was going to present it as an undeniable historical record. By the time I was finished, I had a 40-page binder of absolute, unshakable truth. I had the emerald's journey mapped out from my safe to a vault in New York, but I needed the jewelry back. I didn't want the money. I wanted the weight of those stones around my neck. Through Elias and a very stern letter from a high-powered attorney I'd hired using my personal inheritance, we pressured the broker. Selling stolen goods, even unknowingly, is a felony that ruins reputations. The anonymous buyer was contacted. When faced with the proof of the theft and the threat of a police report that would involve their name in a grand larceny investigation, the buyer agreed to sell the set back for the original purchase price. I paid for it. I emptied my personal savings, the money I had spent a decade building, to buy back what was already mine. I didn't care. The money was just paper. The emeralds were blood and memory. When the courier delivered the velvet box to my office, I didn't open it immediately. I sat with it for an hour, feeling its weight. I was no longer a ghost. I was a woman who had reclaimed her heritage. I tucked the box into the bottom of my bag, right next to the dossier. The gala was only 3 days away. Eleanor thought she had sold my past to fund her present. She had no idea that I had just bought her future, and I was going to show it to her in front of everyone she ever wanted to impress. The courier arrived at my office on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a nondescript, security-sealed package. I didn't open it in front of my colleagues. I took it into the private reading room at the back of the archives, a place where the air is climate-controlled and the only sound is the hum of the dehumidifiers. My hands, which had been steady through months of investigation, finally began to shake as I broke the seal. Inside the layers of bubble wrap and protective casing sat the midnight blue velvet box. I opened it, and the deep, verdant glow of the emeralds felt like a physical warmth against my skin. They were home. I had paid $110,000 to buy back what had been stolen from me, nearly every penny of my personal savings. But as I held the weight of my great-grandmother's legacy in my palm, the money felt irrelevant. It was just paper. These stones were blood, memory, and survival. I didn't take the emeralds home. I knew that Julian and Eleanor still viewed our house as their territory. Instead, I drove straight to a different bank, one where I had opened a private safe deposit box weeks earlier and locked the jewelry away. I kept the key on a ribbon around my neck, hidden beneath my clothes. For the next 3 days, I began the most difficult part of my plan, the performance of defeat. I leaned into the narrative Eleanor had created for me. I acted like a woman who had finally accepted her own instability. When Eleanor came over for lunch and suggested that perhaps I should skip the upcoming Boston Heritage Gala because the excitement might be too much for my fragile state, I didn't argue. I looked down at my plate, let my shoulders slump, and whispered that she might be right. I watched the flash of predatory triumph in her eyes, the same look a hunter gives a trapped animal. She was so convinced of her own superiority that she didn't realize she was talking to an archivist who was currently cataloging her every move. Julian was equally relieved by my apparent submission. He began to treat me with a patronizing kindness, the way one treats a child who has finally stopped throwing a tantrum. He thought the peace in our house was a sign that our marriage was healing. He didn't realize that the peace was actually the silence that precedes a controlled demolition. I watched him and Eleanor discuss the gala as if I were a ghost in the room. They talked about the seating arrangements, the influential guests, and the image they wanted to project as a strong, united Boston family. I listened, I nodded, and I kept my dossier in my work bag, adding the final receipts from the jewelry recovery and the broker's signed statement. Like Sarah in the stories I had studied, I spent my late nights organizing the facts. I didn't need a legal demand. I needed a statement of truth so clear that it could not be reframed. I bought a high-quality leather folder, the kind that sits flat on a table and demands attention. Inside, I arranged the evidence, the digital logs of the safe entry, the GPS records of Eleanor's car in New York, the forged appraisal, and the transfer of funds. It was a perfect audit trail. On the day before the gala, Eleanor brought over a plain beige dress she had picked out for me. "It's modest, Audrey," she said with that silk-wrapped venom. "It won't draw too much attention. In your condition, it's best to blend into the background." I thanked her and took the dress. I even let her see me hanging it up in the front of my closet. But in the back, hidden behind my winter coats, was my own choice. A deep navy silk gown with a neckline specifically designed to showcase the emeralds. I felt a cold, clarifying calm settle over me as the final hours approached. Eleanor thought she had sold my past to secure her social standing. Julian thought he had managed a difficult wife by siding with a powerful mother. They both believed they were in control of the room, the narrative, and the outcome. They had spent months gaslighting me, trying to make me doubt my own eyes and my own history. But tomorrow night, the record was going to speak for itself. I wasn't going to the gala as Julian's troubled wife or Eleanor's charity case. I was going as the keeper of the archives, and I was bringing the truth with me, hanging right where everyone could see it. The Boston Heritage Gala was held at the Alderton Hotel, a venue where the history of the city felt etched into the very marble of the foyer. It was the kind of place where the chandeliers alone cost more than most people's annual salaries, and where the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the quiet, rhythmic hum of high-stakes social transactions. This was Eleanor's home ground. In this room, every handshake was a negotiation, and every introduction was a carefully placed piece on a chessboard. She had spent 40 years building a reputation here as a woman of impeccable taste and unshakable family values. Tonight was supposed to be her victory lap, a night to showcase the unity of the family she had fought so hard to control. The drive to the hotel was conducted in a silence so heavy it felt like a third passenger in the car. Julian kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a tension that betrayed his inner conflict. He had spent months convincing himself that his mother was right and I was failing, yet as we approached the bright lights of the Alderton, he seemed unable to look at me. I sat in the passenger seat, wearing the beige, shapeless dress Eleanor had chosen for me. I looked exactly as they wanted me to look, diminished, unremarkable, and defeated. To anyone watching, I was the troubled wife who was lucky to be invited at all. But beneath that beige dress, my skin was buzzing with a cold, electric anticipation. In the back seat, my evening bag held the leather folder, the dossier of her crimes, and hidden deep in the folds of my heavy wool cloak was the navy silk gown and the velvet box. I felt like an undercover agent entering enemy territory. I wasn't there to be a guest. I was there to be the auditor of their lies. As we walked into the ballroom, the scale of Eleanor's ambition became clear. She had secured the head table, positioned perfectly under the central chandelier. She was already there, draped in silver silk, holding court with a group of the city's most influential patrons. When she saw us approach, her smile didn't just reach her eyes. It stayed there, predatory and bright. She kissed my cheek, her breath smelling of mint and dry sherry. "You look so comfortable, Audrey," she whispered, her eyes scanning my beige dress with a flash of unmistakable triumph. "It's good that you've finally embraced a look that suits your current situation." She turned immediately to Julian, pulling him into a conversation about the upcoming museum board elections, effectively erasing me from the circle. I stood there for a moment, watching the choreography of her manipulation. She guided him, prompted him, and curated his responses with the skill of a master puppeteer. I watched the room, the flash of cameras, the clinking of crystal, the polite, hollow laughter of a crowd that valued appearance over everything else. I felt the weight of the key around my neck, the cold metal a reminder of the truth waiting in the cloakroom. Eleanor thought she was the host of this evening, but she was actually the subject of the final report. I excused myself quietly, telling Julian I needed a moment to compose myself. He nodded without looking up, his face a mask of weary relief that I was leaving. I walked toward the back of the ballroom, my hand resting on the heavy folder in my bag. The setup was complete. The audience was in their seats. Now it was time for the record to speak. I stepped into the cold, clinical quiet of the hotel's private cloakroom. The beige dress Eleanor had chosen for me, the dress that was meant to make me invisible, the dress that signaled my defeat, hit the floor with a soft, insignificant rustle. I reached into my bag and pulled out the navy silk gown I had hidden. As the fabric slid over my skin, I felt the return of the woman who had spent months in the shadows. I took the emeralds from their box. One by one, I fastened the earrings, the bracelet, and finally, the heavy necklace. The stones felt cold at first, then they warmed against my skin, pulsing with the weight of the history they carried. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a ghost. I saw an archivist who had finally found the missing record. I walked back into the ballroom. The shift in the room was almost instantaneous. As I reached the top of the grand marble staircase, the massive crystal chandeliers caught the deep, vivid green of the emeralds, throwing thousands of tiny prisms across the white walls. A few people near the stairs stopped talking. Then a few more. It was a ripple of silence that followed me down the steps. I didn't rush. I walked with the steady, measured pace of someone who knows exactly where they are going. I could feel the eyes of the Boston elite on me, their curiosity piqued by the sudden transformation of the quiet, troubled wife into a woman who looked like she owned the very air she was breathing. I kept my eyes fixed on the head table, where Eleanor and Julian were sitting. Eleanor was in the middle of a sentence, laughing at something a board member had said, when she looked up. The laughter didn't just stop, it died. I watched her face go from a mask of practiced social grace to a look of raw, unadulterated horror. Her hand, clutching a champagne flute, froze in midair. She recognized the stones immediately. She had sold them to a broker in New York. She had seen the forged papers. She had been certain they were gone forever. Julian looked at her, then followed her gaze to me. I saw the moment his confusion turned into a sickening realization. He looked at my neck, then at his mother, then back to me. The fragile woman they had spent months managing was standing before them, wearing the very evidence of their betrayal. I reached the table and stood directly in front of Eleanor. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. In the silence that had now gripped the entire head table, I opened my bag and took out the heavy leather folder. I placed it flat on the table, centered directly in front of Eleanor's plate, exactly like Sarah Carter had done in her story. I looked her in the eye, the first time I had truly looked at her in months, and said, "I think it's time we stop pretending, Eleanor." I turned to Julian, whose face was as white as the tablecloth, and slid the dossier toward him. "The truth has a paper trail, Julian. It's all here. The security logs, the forged appraisals, the broker in Manhattan. Read it." I stood back and waited for the architecture of their lie to collapse. The ballroom remained frozen in that heavy, suffocating silence as I turned and walked toward the exit. I didn't look back at Eleanor. I didn't need to see the wreckage of her reputation to know it was complete. The image of her face, pale, exposed, and utterly shattered, was now a permanent, indelible record in my mind. The drive home was a haunting mirror of the drive there, but the quality of the silence had shifted. It was no longer the silence of tension or gaslighting. It was the hollow silence of a grand structure that had finally collapsed under the weight of its own lies. Julian didn't try to defend her this time. He couldn't. The 40 pages of undeniable evidence were sitting on his lap, a physical weight he could no longer ignore or explain away. When he finally spoke, hours later, his voice was hollow, stripped of its usual patronizing tone. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply asked how I had managed to carry the burden of the investigation all alone while they were trying to convince me I was losing my mind. I told him the truth. I was never actually alone. I had the records, the history, and the collective strength of the women who had worn those emeralds before me. In the months that followed, the fallout was methodical and unforgiving. Eleanor's social standing in Boston evaporated as the story of the stolen emeralds and the forged appraisal circulated through the very circles she lived to impress. My attorney filed a civil suit for fraud and tortious interference, ensuring there were legal consequences for her greed. Julian and I are currently in a space that doesn't have a clean name yet. We are speaking with an honesty that is both brutal and necessary. He is finally learning that loyalty to a toxic lie is not a form of respect, and I am learning that I never needed his validation to be whole. I still work at the archives, tracing the paper trails of the past. But now, when I look at my great-grandmother's emeralds, I see more than just stones. I see the proof that the truth is never truly lost. It is only waiting for someone to stop crying long enough to go looking for it. I am Audrey, and I am the silent witness who finally decided that the record must always speak.